Over the years, I've made the occasional video about my various experiments growing persimmon trees here in my forest. And late last fall, I made a video in which I suggested that hopefully this year, I would finally start to see some persimmons growing here in my forest. And it looks like it's going to come true. And the best part is that there are 3 different persimmon trees producing blossoms, and each of them has a different origin. It began early in May of this year when I noticed that on a few of the persimmon trees there were these little nodules forming just between the leaves on the new growth and the stem of the new growth. And at first I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but as they developed, it became apparent that these must be the beginning of blossoms. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited for what seemed like an eternity to get confirmation that these actually are blossoms. And then finally, it happened. It was very clear that these are blossoms about a week ago when they started to change color, and it was quite clear that these were going to be opening up. And then I noticed that one of them had opened. This is on the largest and oldest of the persimmons, and it came from a root sprout on a very large persimmon tree belonging to my good friend Dolph. And now here we are 6 years later, and it's finally producing blossoms. Notice that this flying insect, some sort of a wasp presumably, is not interested. It seems that the flowers are too small in the opening to be able to get in there, but they are the right size for ants. And so it's clear that it must be intended to be pollinated by ants. Here we are at the second of the persimmon trees that is now blossoming. This is a phenomenal persimmon tree that's only in its 4th year of life, and it grew from a seed, from a persimmon that I ate from Dolph's tree, and I planted the seed. And here we can see one of the blossoms that hasn't yet opened, and it's got that same lovely color as the one that we saw on the one that came from the root sprout. And here's a close-up of another one. There's a little bit of a difference here on this one. Notice the red coloring on the, I guess we could call it the casing surrounding this developing flower. It's red. And I think that's because this one is actually pointing skyward. Most of them are pointing down. And so I think it's been sunburned, and that's why it's red. And here's one that's open. And as you can see, the ants are very curious. Here we can see a close-up of that ant once it actually went into the blossom. And it must be that the nectar is really sweet, or the pollen, or both, I'm not sure at this point. It must be nectar as well, because look at how the ant was busy trying to get this sticky stuff off of his antenna. But he's going back in for more, so it must be very, very tempting, very sweet to make sure that that ant gets right in there. He seems to be exploring the flower quite a bit. And notice how he's rubbing his antenna all over it. It's almost as though perhaps he's leaving scent markings. Perhaps it's part of their way that they communicate with each other to make sure that other ants come as well. And this is that same ant, and he just can't resist going back in yet again. This is the same blossom. This is just a few minutes later when the sun was nice and bright. Notice that on his back leg, there's a little bit of that nectar, and it's stuck quite well onto his leg so that he can transport it to another blossom and get it stuck so that it will pollinate. And now we are coming to the third of the persimmon trees. This one is behind the workshop, down near the pond, and we can hear the frogs in the distance having their fun. This one also came from a root sprout from Dolph, but years later, and I believe from a different tree. And we're going to find out why I believe it's from a different tree in just a moment. This was only acquired by me 2 years ago, and it was not very big when I got it, but as you can see, it grew very fast. Notice how on this one, the flowers, if you will, that are developing have a bit of a twist to them. That's not happening on either of the other persimmon trees. So there's definitely a little bit of a difference to this one. And also, the shape of the unfolding leaves is a little different. And notice that on the leaf that's at the top, it's green. And the ones that are on the bottom are clearly redder, if you will. They're more red. And I think, again, that's just because they are getting the sun on them, because this blossom is pointing sideways. And notice here, again, that we have the flying insect, and it's just not interested. And it must be tempting because those ants love it so much, so it must be sweet and tempting to them, but it's clearly designed so that only the ants can get in. If you look closely, you'll notice that on this branch there are 3 blossoms, and only the one in the middle is open. But it won't be long before the other ones are too. And here's another one that hasn't yet opened. And here we are at the end of the day. This is the same day, and we are back at the first tree with the first blossom that I showed at the beginning of this video. And the flower is gone. But you can see it's still very tempting to the ants. What happened to the flower? And the ants are definitely still very much interested. Perhaps they want to spend the night here, where it's going to be nice and cozy. Looking down lower on the tree, down all the way to the ground, straight down from that blossom, in the wildflowers, we can see the flower from the blossom. It's served its purpose and it's been dropped. This only lasted for 1 day. Timing seems to be very important, and I'm really curious, how is this going to work when there are so few blossoms? Will there be any persimmons this year? Because it would take quite a bit of luck to have those ants go all the way from one blossom to the other and cross-pollinate them when there are so few. I'm hoping that there will be at least 1 persimmon on each of these 3 trees, so that by the end of the year, when they're finally ripe, I'll be able to compare the fruits. And I'm very curious how they differ. And most importantly, what is the one that grew from seed going to taste like? Hopefully there will be persimmons this year to find out.